My name is NATTEL. I'm going to be talking today about reviewing articles in the literature. Let's see. I've advanced the slides. Okay. So this is an outline of my presentation. I'm going to talk about the goals of the review process and what to think about, how to judge specific components of the paper. Then after going through kind of a detailed approach, I'm going to discuss the express approach, which is once you're experienced, you can review papers much faster that way, and then I'll take any questions. So the goals of the review process. So first and foremost, you want to judge a paper's suitability for a given journal and provide the editor with clear and prompt feedback. By the way, a part that is often not so well done, excuse me, is the comments to the editor. The comments to the editor are very important. You don't want to just copy paste your detailed comments to the author in a space for comments to the editor. The purpose of the comments to the editor are to give the editor clear feedback on what you think of the paper. Is it a good paper? Is it a bad paper? What are the main, summarize the main concerns, and then whether you think it should be accepted, rejected, or good but needs revision, or not good now but has the potential to be acceptable in that journal and requires major revision or reject, resubmit. You also want to help the author by providing clear explanations of the basis for your recommendations. Nothing is more frustrating for an editor than when two reviewers recommend rejection and neither one has any comments that look like they justify rejection. So don't be afraid if you think a paper, there's no reason to provide hurtful or insulting statements. There's lots of reason not to, but there is a reason if you think a paper is not good to tell the author why it's not good, or at least why it's not good for this journal. At least then they'll know why their paper is being rejected. And secondly, providing feasible suggestions to improve the paper. So this is particularly important if you think it has a chance to be accepted and requires revision. But even if you think it's not appropriate for the journal or should be rejected, it's good to provide suggestions as to how it could be improved to reach an acceptable level. And, you know, if you feel that, let's say you're reviewing for circulation research and you feel that the paper is interesting but not sufficiently novel, you can say, you know, this is an interesting and well done paper, but the novelty is somewhat limited. One potentially important comment is that your goal is not to provide detailed and grammar and spelling corrections. So if you think the English in a paper is bad, then you can certainly say the English composition and grammar needs improvement. And you could give a couple of examples so that the author knows that you're not just saying it, but you have a basis for it. But you don't have to go through and proofread the paper as though it was a paper of a colleague that you're a co-author on and you want to try to make sure it's optimized. So, you know, I say this knowing that when I started out to review papers many years ago, my reviews were several pages long and had detailed grammatical and spelling suggestions. I suppose I was fine at the time when I had lots of time and not a ton of other things to do, but it's really not necessary. Okay, now the next set of questions is what the reviewer should be thinking about. So the first question is, does this paper address a specific question? Any good paper addresses one or more specific questions and ideally should say what those questions are up front. If there's no questions, then right away it makes the paper much more difficult and of much less value. So a paper that just provides a description of something is already on weak ground. You know, we reviewed 500 patients with such and such a syndrome to describe what it is. I guess there your question is, what are the features of this syndrome? But it's much more difficult to come up with something worthwhile than if you say, our goal was to know whether, I don't know, heart failure is common in patients with COVID or something like that. That's an answerable question. Then did the paper provide an answer to the question? So if it posed a specific question, did it answer it? Or did it just give a lot of data, but not really, that don't really address the question? And finally, the last question you should ask yourself is, does anybody care? So if the paper has a specific question and provides an answer, but the question has been asked 500 times in the literature before, and the answer is largely the same as other people's, or if it's a trivial question, I don't know, are Danish people taller than Chinese? That's kind of a question that people know the answer to already. So it's a question that nobody cares about because a priori. Okay, so what to look for specifically? What question did this paper address? Is it clear? Is the rationale clear? And this should all come out in the introduction. So the purpose of the introduction is to state clearly the objectives of the paper and to provide the rationale for the objectives so that the reader or reviewer knows why it was worth addressing. The second question is, did the paper provide an answer to the question? And that you'll see from the methods and the results. And these should be stated clearly enough for you to know whether the question was answered by reliable methods and whether the results were clear-cut. Thirdly, is this the first time this question has been addressed and answered? And that will come out in the discussion. And the final one is, does anybody care about the question and or answer? And again, that should be addressed in the discussion. And it's preferable for authors writing papers to keep these objectives in mind for each of these sections, and for reviewers to be looking for the answers to these questions in the respective sections. Then there are some journal-specific considerations. The first question is the paper appropriate for this journal? If you send a descriptive basic science paper with no immediate clinical application to a clinical journal, it may not be optimally appropriate. On the other hand, if you send a strictly clinical paper to basic science journals, depending on the nature of the paper, it may also not be appropriate for the journal. Then, does it deal with a topic that will be of interest to enough of the readership? Then an estimation of the importance of the contribution. And that's a little bit like, that's a little bit hard. It's a little bit like taste, like art. To some extent, there are questions and answers that are obviously of extreme importance, and there'll be no question about it. And there are questions and answers that are obviously unimportant, and there'll be no question about it. But between those two, there can be a lot of contributions that different reviewers may disagree about the importance. So that is a subjective thing, but is a very important point for any reviewer to address and put into their comments to the editor, as well as possibly their comments to the author. Okay, so now we're going to talk about judging specific components of the paper. So the title. The title is something that people often don't give enough thought to, and it's very, very important. It should clearly inform readers about what the paper adds to the literature, and should attract readers to the paper and avoid a purely parochial focus. So the title should clearly indicate to the readers and the reviewer what the paper is about and give a sense of why it's important. Sometimes the title doesn't do that at all, and it's helpful if the reviewers help the author by suggesting a more appropriate title. And the question to ask yourself is, first, does the title describe the contents well? First and foremost. And also be aware, sometimes people choose cutesy titles, something that's catchy for an editorial, for example. You'll often see those. That's, again, a matter of taste, but personally, I don't mind those kinds of titles. I think they're fun, but often it's helpful to add something to the title after your cutesy title, like, I don't know, let's say pick a title like Man Loves Woman. And it's a paper about, I don't know, how intramarrial relations can affect the outcome of heart disease. Well, the title doesn't tell the readers anything about what the article is. I understand you may want to attract people to the article and leave a little mystery, but personally, I would prefer with a title like that to make it Man Loves Woman hyphen or colon intramarital relations affect outcomes in heart disease. So that maintains the cutesy part of it, but at least gives the reader some idea of what the paper is about. The abstract. The abstract is another very important element of papers that is often overlooked. Very often people spend so much time worrying about the contents of the paper that by the time they get to write the abstract, they're exhausted and they write the shortest possible thing they can that doesn't say anything. So the abstract should provide potential readers with a clear summary of all essential components of the paper. It should make clear the rationale for the work. You can often do that in 1 or 2 sentences. Describe succinctly any major methods, should summarize key results, and should conclude with a statement of the essential findings of the paper and why they're important. The abstract should not be an afterthought. I would say that on at least 30 or 40% of the papers that get accepted in the journal that I'm the editor for, which is Canadian Journal of Cardiology, I provide a comment to the author that's basically the same comment all the time, which is, you have only used 100 out of the 250 available words for the abstract. The abstract is all that 90% of readers see and is what will determine whether they bother reading the paper or citing it. Therefore, it's in the author's interest to make sure that the abstract is as informative and interesting as possible. So keep that in mind when you're commenting on an abstract, and of course, if you're writing a paper. The background. The background should summarize the literature that puts into the context the goals of the study. So that's the rationale I mentioned. It should clearly state the goals of the paper. So really, it's very difficult to write a good paper without in the introduction just very clearly stating the goal of this paper was, or this paper was designed to address the following questions, or something like that. Importantly, it need not and probably should not be an attempt to fully review the background literature. Sometimes the background section of a paper, I'm just going to check, my sister texted me, dire qu'elle n'est pas encore morte, tout un caractère. Okay. It need not and probably should not be an attempt to fully review the background literature. Sometimes, as I was saying, you'll see a paper that with such a long background that the reviewer and reader is so thoroughly bored by the end of the time they get through the background, they don't even want to look at the paper. And then you come back, when you get to the discussion, it basically repeats a lot of the material in the introduction. So the introduction doesn't need any kind of full literature review. What it needs is to summarize the key papers that are necessary to take consideration of in order to understand why the study was done. Okay, methods. So the methods should provide a succinct description of the methods used. In principle, a reader should be able to repeat the study based on the method's description. And everyone should note a key issue in research is reproducibility. Although we generally get little mileage of a study that simply reproduces a prior finding, but nevertheless, it's very important to know how the experimenters or researchers did their study so that it can be reproduced and tested again, because sometimes people find something different, and sometimes they find an explanation for why the results are different. So it's very important to have a clear method section. A detailed method section may be too many words to go into the paper, because if there's word count limits at that journal, and then you can have a detailed online methods section with a summary of the essential methods in the main paper. Results should provide in clear form all the results of the study that are needed to understand what the study found, including results of necessary controls, population properties, key outcomes, etc. Display items like tables and figures are key to transmit the findings for original studies or concepts and literature for review papers. Keep in mind, again, after the title and the abstract, the next thing most readers look at is the display items. And often they're the only things a reader looks at. So the tables and figures are very, very important. Graphs should be clearly labeled and identified. If you're reviewing a paper and you can barely read the axis labels, or the symbols are too faint, or the graph is too crowded, or something like that, you should comment on that. Material that needs to be available but doesn't need to be in the main paper can go into an online supplement, and of course many of us may take advantage of that. So as a reviewer, you want to look very carefully at the results section, and if you can provide useful comments for how to better display the results, those are always welcome. The discussion should put the findings of the study into the context of the literature. That's where you're going to, particularly if you don't know the field, where you're going to find out how the findings fit into the field. And if you do know the field, you're going to want to make sure that the discussion puts the results into a proper context. Sometimes when I'm reviewing a paper, or as an editor, I'll take out sort of the key words of the title and do a Medline search and just look quickly to see if the same work has already been done, if there are other studies that are closely related, and whether they're similar or different, and so on. The discussion should state clearly what the novel aspects of the study are and support that claim based on prior studies that have addressed this or related questions. So if that's not done in the discussion, one of your important comments are going to be, it's something like, it's not clear what's new about this study, and the authors should spell it out very clearly in any revision. It should show why the results are important and relevant to cardiovascular medicine. So sometimes you'll get a paper to review that provides the results, puts it into context, but doesn't give you any clue of why it's important. Now, if you know the field well, you may be able to judge how important it is. Even so, it's important to direct the authors to make that clear to readers who are not as knowledgeable as you. But if you're not knowledgeable in the area and you read the discussion and it doesn't make at all clear why you should care about the result, then you have to tell the authors that they should make it much clearer. It should also state any major limitations the reader should consider. So again, if you know the area and you know that there are major limitations that the authors haven't dealt with, you certainly should tell them to address these limitations. And if those limitations make the results unreliable, you should tell them that, and that can be a rationale for rejection of the paper. And of course, it should highlight any major conceptual issues how do these findings fit into our understanding of the field? What is their relevance for management issues and so forth? The conclusions are not a required part of the paper. Most journals don't require a conclusion section, but all papers should end with a concluding paragraph with one or more key takeaway messages. And even a short paper like a research letter, which is limited to 800 words, should still end with at least one sentence giving the key takeaway messages, which might be something like, our results, the results we present here are important for understanding such and such and may have implications for such and such, or something like that. This conclusion section, if it's a section or a paragraph, can follow a formal conclusions heading, but it doesn't have to. I tend to prefer to have a section that says conclusions, but you can just have a concluding paragraph. Importantly, the conclusion should not simply be a repetition or extensive summary of the results. For the conclusion section, they should kind of put everything together and summarize it, summarize the key takeaway points. A conclusion that's basically just a repetition or a long summary of the results is not really very useful for the reader. It's very important that it state any essential findings or ideas and briefly why they're important. And I know I've already mentioned a couple of times that the importance should be outlined in the discussion, should be summarized in the conclusion, that the abstract should say very clearly why the results are important. But that's very important because if the results aren't important, then who cares? And you need to make it very clear to the reviewers and the readers why they're important. Okay, so what I've just given you is a detailed overview of the things to look for in a paper and how to judge them. And I find that, especially for beginning reviewers, it's helpful to have sort of that outline and to use it to make sure you've addressed the key points in the paper. There is an express approach that I usually take in reviewing a paper and that more experienced reviewers can use, and I'm going to give that to you now. So the first thing you do is read the title and the abstract and judge whether they convince you that the paper might be adding something useful to the literature. So that starts you off right away with an impression. Is this paper useful or is it not? Then you confirm that impression by looking at the display items. Do the data presented suggest that the findings are novel and solid? Okay, so if you think the paper is not useful because it's really not very novel, and then you go to the display items and the graphs and figures don't really have anything that's not already very much in the literature, then, so if they do look novel and solid, if the combination of title and abstract and display items convince you that there might be something useful here, then go through the analysis, the detailed analysis as I described above. But if not, take a quick look at the results and discussion, see if there's anything that changes your mind. And if there is, go through the careful analysis again. But if not, so basically the purpose of this express approach is that if the title and abstract suggest this paper doesn't give anything new to the literature, and the display items reinforce that idea, and a quick look at the results and discussion support that concept, then you can write a brief but informative and clear review stating in your opinion why this paper should be rejected. And you know, if you're a busy reviewer, this can save you a lot of time. And I have to say, as an editor of a journal, I apply this approach to many, many papers and can make a decision without going through the whole detailed approach in under 15 minutes for many papers. So I'm not trying to tell you to do a quick and dirty approach, but on the other hand, I'm telling you that once you've had a fair amount of experience and you feel confident, then it could be a way to save you significant time in reviewing. It will accelerate the review process importantly for many papers, but it's only for experienced reviewers. It's certainly not for someone who's just starting out. Okay, so that's the end of my formal presentation, and now I'll be happy to take any and all questions on this topic.